This little piece of clay is packed full of information from 4,200 years ago. The language of the inscription is Sumerian, is the oldest written language.
Imagine opening a forgotten museum drawer that hasn't been touched in generations. Inside are 6 broken pieces of baked clay, each no larger than the palm of your hand. Dust covers their edges. The catalog cards beside them are faded, their labels written decades ago by people who never knew the secrets those fragments might contain. For nearly a century, they sat unnoticed among thousands of other pieces collected from the ancient deserts of Iraq. Then, in 2025, everything changed. Not because archaeologists discovered a new temple, not because treasure hunters unearthed a lost city, and not because anyone found a perfectly preserved ancient manuscript. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 2,000 subscribers. Your support helps us continue exploring the greatest mysteries of history, ancient civilizations, and discoveries hidden for centuries. Because what happened next was unlike any discovery before. A machine was given the chance to examine these forgotten fragments, comparing them with thousands of other ancient texts scattered across museums around the world. And when it began connecting the broken pieces, it revealed patterns hidden inside symbols pressed into clay more than 5,000 years ago. Patterns that forced historians to look again at the oldest written stories of humanity. Stories about creation, knowledge, gods, and the mysterious origins of us. Instead, 6 forgotten fragments, excavated decades earlier and almost completely ignored, were digitally compared with thousands of other cuneiform tablets using modern artificial intelligence. What happened next surprised even the researchers. The computer began connecting broken sentences that had been separated by museums, countries, and more than 100 years of cataloging. Lines that had never been read together suddenly fit like pieces of an enormous 5,000-year-old puzzle. And the picture that slowly emerged wasn't what anyone expected. Some passages sounded less like prayers. Others didn't resemble royal propaganda or tax records. In places, they almost read like instructions, reports, descriptions of an ongoing project. And according to those ancient writings, the subject of that project appeared to be humanity itself. Where did we come from? Why were we created? And who, according to the oldest civilization on Earth, decided how much knowledge humans should ever possess? Now, before you jump to conclusions, it's important to understand what actually happened. Nobody uncovered a secret instruction manual for the human race. No archaeologist found a hidden chamber containing the answers to creation. The reality is quieter and, in many ways, even stranger. For more than 150 years, scholars have translated Sumerian tablets, one fragment at a time. A broken corner here, half a sentence there, one museum in London, another in Berlin, another in Baghdad, another locked away inside university collections that few people outside the field have ever seen. Human experts did extraordinary work, but no single person could ever read everything. Artificial intelligence didn't discover new evidence. It simply looked at old evidence all at once. And once it compared thousands of fragments simultaneously, something unexpected happened. The same unusual phrases began appearing again and again and again. Across different cities, across different centuries, across tablets written hundreds of years apart. Suddenly, isolated fragments that had seemed unrelated started forming larger stories. Stories that historians are still debating today. To understand why that matters, we have to travel back more than 5,500 years. Long before Rome, long before Egypt built its greatest pyramids, long before the Bible was written. In the broad river valley of southern Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, a civilization appeared unlike anything the world had seen before. The Sumerians, around 3,500 BCE, while much of humanity still lived in scattered farming villages, the people of Sumer were constructing enormous cities from millions of sun-dried mud bricks. Eridu, which they believed was the world's first city. Uruk, whose massive walls would later inspire legends. Ur, famous for its towering step temples. Lagash, Nippur, the sacred religious center where priests carefully copied holy writings for nearly 2,000 years. These weren't villages. Some housed tens of thousands of people, astonishing populations for their time. Canals stretched across the landscape, boats carried grain through artificial waterways. Temple complexes dominated the skyline like man-made mountains. But their greatest invention wasn't architecture, it was memory. For the first time in human history, spoken language could outlive the speaker. Using sharpened reeds, Sumerian scribes pressed tiny wedge-shaped impressions into soft clay, creating what we now call cuneiform writing. When the tablets dried beneath the Mesopotamian sun or were accidentally baked in fires, they became incredibly durable. Thoughts became permanent. Contracts survived generations. Kings spoke across millennia. Stories waited. And wait they did. Empires rose. Empires collapsed. The Euphrates shifted its course. Canals filled with silt. Temples crumbled into dust. Entire cities disappeared beneath layers of wind-blown earth. Ironically, that destruction became the reason the tablets survived. Protected beneath collapsed walls and buried beneath dry desert soil, countless clay tablets remained hidden for nearly 5,000 years. Then came the great excavations. Beginning in the mid-1800s, archaeologists from Britain, France, Germany, and later Iraq uncovered ancient libraries unlike anything ever imagined. Thousands of tablets became tens of thousands. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. The discoveries were overwhelming. There was only one problem. Almost nobody on Earth could read them. Each tablet had to be cleaned, cataloged, numbered, stored. Most were placed inside museum drawers to await translation. Some have remained there ever since. Even today, well over a century after many of these discoveries were made, enormous museum collections still contain cuneiform tablets that have never been fully translated. Some haven't been studied since the day they were excavated. The first texts scholars managed to decipher seemed familiar enough. Royal inscriptions, receipts, grain inventories, tax records, livestock accounts, religious hymns, administrative documents, exactly the sort of paperwork every civilization leaves behind. For decades, historians believed they understood the collection, mostly bureaucracy, mostly religion, mostly ordinary history. Then came the exceptions. Hidden among economic records and temple accounts were stories unlike anything else. Stories describing the beginning of the world, the creation of humanity, gods walking among people, humans formed from clay and divine blood, and the purpose those humans were supposedly created to serve. The deeper scholars dug, the stranger the pattern became. Yet they faced a problem no amount of expertise could solve. No one could see the entire puzzle. One fragment sat in London, another in Istanbul, a third in Philadelphia. A fourth remained unpublished in a museum basement. A fifth had been photographed decades earlier but never translated. Thousands of tiny pieces were scattered across continents. No single scholar, not even across an entire lifetime, could hold every fragment in memory at once. And perhaps that wasn't the real mystery. Perhaps the real mystery was whether those forgotten pieces had been waiting all along for something capable of reading them together. That was the impossible burden carried by every scholar who dedicated a lifetime to these ancient texts. They weren't lazy, they weren't careless, They were simply overwhelmed by a mountain of history that no single person could ever hope to climb. Imagine spending 30 or 40 years mastering one of the most difficult writing systems ever created, only to discover that, after an entire career, you had personally translated just a few thousand tablets out of a collection numbering in the hundreds of thousands. By the time many experts retired, they knew more about cuneiform than almost anyone alive. Yet they had still seen only a tiny fraction of what remained buried inside museum collections around the world. The real enemy wasn't intelligence, it was time. Every translated tablet raised new questions instead of providing final answers. While one researcher carefully deciphered a damaged inscription from the city of Ur, another might spend years studying tablets from Nippur without ever realizing the two collections contained different chapters of the same story. The knowledge existed. It was simply scattered too widely for any human mind to assemble. And cuneiform itself refused to make the task any easier. Unlike modern alphabets, where each letter represents a sound, cuneiform is a maze of wedge-shaped symbols, whose meaning changes depending on context. One sign might represent an entire word in a royal inscription, a syllable in a legal contract, or something completely different inside a religious hymn. Some symbols have 4 or 5 accepted readings, and deciding which one is correct often depends on understanding the very sentence you're still trying to translate. It created an almost impossible paradox. To translate the sentence correctly, you first had to understand its meaning. But understanding its meaning required translating the sentence correctly. It was like standing before a locked door, where the only key had been hidden on the other side. The puzzle became even more complicated because these tablets were never written in just one language. Sumerian, the oldest known written language, appeared first around 3400 BCE. Even today, linguists describe it as a language isolate, meaning it has no known living relatives anywhere on Earth. Unlike Latin, which evolved into French, Spanish, and Italian, Sumerian simply vanished, leaving no direct descendants behind. Then, around 2300 BCE, another civilization rose to power. The Akkadians conquered much of Mesopotamia, but instead of replacing Sumerian culture, they absorbed it. They continued using cuneiform while introducing their own language, which later evolved into Babylonian and Assyrian dialects. Generation after generation, scribes copied older texts that were already ancient in their own time. Sometimes they misunderstood older expressions. Sometimes they modernized unfamiliar words. Every copy added another layer between the original author and the reader living thousands of years later. Imagine making a photocopy of a photocopy, then copying that version again, and repeating the process for nearly 2,000 years. Tiny mistakes accumulate, meanings drift, entire ideas slowly blur around the edges until nobody is completely certain what the original sentence intended to say. As if language itself wasn't difficult enough, time had inflicted its own damage. Many tablets survived only because they had been buried beneath collapsed buildings, after wars, earthquakes, or abandoned cities. Their corners had snapped away. Their surfaces had been worn smooth by centuries underground. Sometimes the most important sentence on the entire tablet had vanished forever, leaving behind only empty space where the clay had crumbled into dust more than 3,000 years ago. Scholars became experts at reading silence almost as much as they read words. A translation might begin confidently with, "The God created," only to stop abruptly because the next several lines no longer existed. The missing section could contain a single ordinary sentence, or the entire point of the document. There was no way to know. For more than 100 years, that was simply accepted as part of the profession. Historians translated whatever fragments they possessed and published careful interpretations, fully aware that somewhere else another missing piece might exist. Yet there was no practical way to compare every museum collection across the world. Picture a researcher working late inside the British Museum sometime in the 1970s. After months of painstaking effort, he finally translates half of an ancient creation story recovered from southern Iraq decades earlier. The upper section is broken away, but the surviving lines seem important enough to publish. His paper enters academic literature, becomes another small piece of Mesopotamian scholarship, and quietly settles onto library shelves. What he never discovers is that the missing portion of his tablet isn't actually lost. It's sitting inside another museum, perhaps in Berlin, perhaps in Istanbul, perhaps in Philadelphia. Catalogued under the wrong excavation number after an administrative mistake made 50 years earlier. Stored inside a drawer that no specialist has opened in decades because everyone assumes it's just another damaged economic record. The two halves of the same story remain separated, not by thousands of years, but by paperwork, geography, and human limitation. One fragment waits patiently for the other, while oceans, borders, and forgotten filing systems keep them apart. That was the invisible wall blocking this entire field of study. The answers weren't necessarily missing. They were hiding in plain sight, buried not beneath sand, but beneath catalogs, storage boxes, museum basements, and the unavoidable reality that no single scholar could ever read everything. The problem was never access. The problem was scale. For the first time in history, humanity possessed more ancient information than humanity itself could process. And that is exactly the kind of challenge machines excel at solving. When researchers began applying advanced artificial intelligence to ancient Mesopotamian languages in 2025, the headlines made it sound as though computers had suddenly decoded the secrets of civilization overnight. The reality was both more ordinary and far more fascinating. Instead of searching for new discoveries, researchers gathered everything they already possessed. Every published translation, every scanned tablet, every hand-drawn copy made by archaeologists over the last century, every damaged inscription, every partially translated fragment. Hundreds of thousands of digital records flowed into a single learning system trained specifically on Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and related cuneiform texts. For the first time, every surviving fragment could be examined together. A human scholar remembers yesterday's discoveries. A machine remembers everything. It never grows tired after 10 hours of translation. It never forgets a phrase encountered months earlier. It can compare thousands of damaged inscriptions simultaneously, noticing that a broken sentence from one museum perfectly completes another fragment stored thousands of kilometers away under an entirely different catalog number. The artificial intelligence wasn't asked to invent missing words. It wasn't told what theories to support. It wasn't searching for aliens, lost civilizations, or hidden conspiracies. Its assignment was remarkably simple. Read everything. Compare everything. Tell us what fits. Almost immediately, surprising connections began appearing. Broken sentences suddenly became complete. Fragments separated for generations matched like pieces of a shattered mirror. Passages that scholars had always translated independently began revealing entirely new contexts once they were reunited. And as more pieces connected, another pattern quietly emerged. Not a forgotten king, not an undiscovered city, not a lost treasure. A pattern hidden inside language itself. The first anomaly wasn't a dramatic prophecy or a shocking prediction. It was something much smaller. A word, Actually, several words. Modern people rarely think about the word human. To us, it feels obvious. We are one species sharing one beginning. Whether someone believes that beginning came through evolution, divine creation, or another explanation entirely, the assumption remains remarkably similar. Humanity starts at one point, and every person belongs to the same story. But when the AI compared thousands of Sumerian texts side by side, that assumption became less straightforward. Instead of using one consistent word for people, the tablets repeatedly used several different terms. On individual tablets, the difference seemed insignificant. A translator naturally rendered each as people or humankind and continued reading. Only when thousands of examples were placed beside one another did something unusual become visible. The words behaved differently. Certain terms appeared repeatedly alongside construction, agriculture, and physical labor. Others clustered around ordinary family life, leadership, worship, and social organization. The boundaries rarely overlapped. To someone reading one damaged fragment, the distinction disappeared almost completely. To something reading 10,000 fragments at once, the distinction became impossible to ignore. For the first time, researchers were forced to ask a question that had remained hidden inside the world's oldest written language for more than 5,000 years. What if these words weren't simply poetic variations? What if they were categories? And once that possibility entered the conversation, every connected fragment suddenly became far more interesting than anyone expected. The deeper the AI searched, the stranger the language became. It wasn't uncovering dramatic prophecies or hidden names of forgotten kings. Instead, it kept stumbling across the same small phrases, repeated so consistently that they refused to fade into the background. One expression translated, as closely as scholars could manage, into something like working life. Another became lowly clay. And then there was a third phrase, the one that reportedly made researchers stop and read the surrounding lines several times before moving on. It translated roughly as, "those who do not multiply." On their own, none of these expressions would have raised many eyebrows. Ancient literature is overflowing with symbolism. Every civilization wrapped its beliefs in metaphor. Lowly clay sounds exactly like the sort of humble image you'd expect from a culture whose creation stories described humanity being formed from earth by the hands of the gods. For more than a century, that's exactly how these phrases were treated. They were poetic flourishes, colorful language decorating religious stories. Translators noted them, appreciated them, and then continued to the next line. There seemed to be no reason to believe they carried any deeper technical meaning. But computers don't appreciate poetry. They measure patterns. They count frequencies. They compare every occurrence without assuming what any phrase is supposed to mean. And when this particular AI counted those expressions across thousands of tablets, something unusual emerged. The phrases weren't scattered randomly the way metaphors usually are. They appeared beside the same kinds of people, beside the same activities, beside the same outcomes, again and again, across texts copied centuries apart and recovered from cities separated by hundreds of kilometers. A metaphor usually drifts over time. Its wording changes, its meaning evolves. This didn't. It stayed remarkably consistent, almost as if the scribes were referring to something specific rather than simply writing beautiful prose. That observation doesn't prove anything by itself. The phrases weren't scattered randomly the way metaphors usually are. They appeared beside the same kinds of people, beside the same activities, beside the same outcomes, again and again, across texts copied centuries apart and recovered from cities separated by hundreds of kilometers. A metaphor usually drifts over time. Its wording changes, its meaning evolves. This didn't. It stayed remarkably consistent, almost as if the scribes were referring to something specific, rather than simply writing beautiful prose. That observation doesn't prove anything by itself. Patterns are not evidence of hidden history, but they can reveal questions that nobody realized they should ask. And this particular pattern pointed toward one uncomfortable possibility. Within the logic of these ancient stories, some groups of people appeared to exist for a purpose, not merely to live, not simply to inherit the world, but to work. Again and again, certain groups were described carrying stone, digging canals, building walls, maintaining fields, and performing the heavy labor required to keep the earliest cities alive. Whether that language reflected mythology, social hierarchy, or something else entirely remains a matter of debate. But the recurring association was difficult to ignore once every surviving example was examined together. That is also where the phrase, "those who do not multiply," suddenly sounded different. Not because anyone had proven it described literal biology, but because, inside the stories themselves, the wording almost resembled a specification. A tool doesn't reproduce. A tool is made, used, and eventually replaced. Whether the ancient authors intended that interpretation is impossible to know. Many historians argue these passages simply reflect how ruling elites viewed laborers rather than describing actual categories of humanity. That remains the mainstream understanding, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Empires throughout history have often described workers in dehumanizing ways. Ancient Egypt did it, Rome did it, medieval kingdoms did it. Modern societies have found their own versions as well. Reading symbolic labor language literally would be a mistake. Yet the AI highlighted something that made researchers look twice. The texts didn't describe only one laboring group. They appeared to describe several. And that was where the language became considerably more complicated. Among the terms appearing repeatedly were two names that scholars have debated for generations. The first was Lulu. In many translations, Lulu simply refers to ordinary human beings, the general population. People living ordinary lives, raising families, farming, trading, worshiping, and participating in society like everyone else. The second term was Sag Giga. For more than a century, the